everyone. I'm Tiffany Eddy, and I am joined by my partner in crime here, Mr. Tom Prasol of Demers and Prasol, and we are so pleased to be bringing you another episode of
Anything But Politics.
And today we have the pleasure of having a new guest on, and we're so excited to explore his life and backstory. So, Tom?
Yeah, you know, Tiffany, it's amazing because I feel like we've been really, lucky in the fact that the last few guests we've had have really turned out to be experts in a specific area. And today we're joined by someone who's just starting their second term in the New Hampshire House. And they're certainly an expert and an author of the book Needless Suffering. But, they're an expert in an area that I think everyone can relate to, which is pain. And not the type of pain that I am to you as far as a pain in the neck, but a type of pain.
Well, I was hoping to get some insights on that too, but yes.
Yeah, we've got some free advice coming our way. But, without further ado, we want to introduce, Dr. Representative David Nagel.
Hi. Thanks.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. And
pleasure.
to go back a little bit, so, we have so much to talk about, and you have done many, many, many fascinating things that we're going to try to get to. But let's just go to you. You're not a New Hampshire native, so you grew up in a place that's apparently getting a lot of snow right now?
Yep. I grew up in Snowbelt, Orchard Park, New York. It's the home of this little football team, Buffalo Bills.
Oh, yes.
But that's...
We don't have
heard-
to talk about them right
No,
now.
Never
it's
heard
not,
of them.
It's not the neatest thing about Orchard Park. The neatest thing about Orchard Park that really meant a lot to me was it was the last stop in the Underground Railroad.
Oh,
The town
wow.
was founded by Quakers. The main street is Quaker Street. And when I was a kid, in between snowstorms, you could go into somebody's house on Quaker Street. You go to the basement, and there were tunnels that would connect houses that were used originally to hide slaves and things like that. And for the
Wow.
most part, they were like blocked out, but it was just a neat part of the history of the area. And what was really neat about it, that was kind of also unusual, I think, was, like my childhood hero was Frederick Douglass, and that was totally unrelated. But the concept that you could just get along with a lot of different types of people in different ways and be just totally oblivious to your phenotypical differences, that was just normal there. And I remember there was this guy, Butch Bird, that played for the Bills in the 60s. And he was like, one of their defensive backs. And he would, he said that, he grew up in upstate New York and he was black and he was totally oblivious to the whole concept of racism until he got to play in the AFL All-Star game in New Orleans. And it was the first time he'd ever experienced in his life. And it was just, in retrospect, was such a great place to grow up.
Yeah.
And it's hard to leave, very hard to leave.
Yeah, it certainly sounds amazing. And how long were you in there? How long were you up there?
Well, technically, I kind of still am, but pretty much by the time I was 18, I'd kind of, moved on, just, go home for family events, things like that. But, it's still home to me. I still have friends there. My parents passed away a couple of years ago, so I don't really have direct family there anymore, but... my friend Jeanette, who probably won't watch this, but she was my next door neighbor.
We welcome everyone.
Yeah.
Jeanette still
All are welcome to watch.
If you email Jeanette, she will send you a picture of our first communion when we were, 8 years old or something. I was forced to hold her hand, and she still likes sharing that picture. So I still have friends
take it.
there.
We'll take the picture. Yeah. So then, but you lived in Sitka. Is it Sitka or Sika? Sitka, Alaska. So if you could just kind of fill me in a little bit, you went from basically the Buffalo area and then out to Alaska. And what were you doing out there?
So
Shoveling.
Besides shoveling
no,
snow?
there's no snow, very little snow.
Unlike what
in
you
Sitka.
shovel.
Yeah, that was stereotypical about Alaska. I had to correct the governor on that yesterday. Sitka's actually, if this is Alaska, that's where Sitka's anchorage is here, but the coast, the Japanese current keeps it relatively warm, so it doesn't really snow much at sea level there. So we really got more rain than snow, and it never really got that cold. But I'm kind of rebellious. I've always been a rebel my entire life. I use a form of advocacy I call John the Baptist advocacy, a voice crying in the wilderness. And I learned that very early from my mother and somebody else. But this opportunity came up when I was in med school to work with the Indian Health Service. And I just, for some reason, I always wanted to go up there.
And what is it, the Indian Health Service? And what was it why did you want to go to Alaska?
Not really. I don't know why. I mean, I've always been an outdoorsy person. Alaska is the last frontier. There was just something, I don't know, John Krakauer had written a book about the need for young people to explore, get their rite of passage, that kind of thing. And to me, it was the rite of passage for me was to go up there. But, I grew up right next to the Seneca Reservation, so we had a lot of native experience as a child. And I kind of felt like I owed something to somebody. I applied for the Navy and was denied because of my exercise-induced asthma, which I will never understand, but we can take that with the Navy on another day. But the good news was this was another way to serve somebody. So I went up there. It was to this day probably one of the greatest experiences of my life, because you have to leave what your comfort zone is behind and go to an area with people that you really share very little in common with, and you need to fit into their culture. And Sitka is a very small town, so you get to know people very quickly. And if you don't fit in, you're not going to have fun there. So you have to find a way to adapt to them rather than forcing them to adapt to you. And I made so many friends there, and learned a lot, because the more you give to somebody else, the more they're willing to give to you. So they taught me all sorts of stuff, and fishing. I never really got into the hunting thing. I'm not against it. It's just it wasn't me. But the fishing, I don't mind sticking a hook through a fish's mouth. But stuff like that, and then hearing their stories and then helping them with their problems. It was kind of a two-way street, and I got paid nothing to do it. So, if I had gotten paid to do that, I think it would have cheapened the experience a lot.
Well, it sounds amazing. Yeah. And to the fishing point, I don't mind casting, but getting the hook off the fish is the most horrible thing in the world, I think.
It was really fun, though. I do have to tell you, this is the greatest thing. So my friend Paula, I went back to visit her there, and she lived right on the ocean. And, people come from all over the world to take tour boats to see what I was living in, So I put my tent up while I was visiting her on the seashore, and I'd go fishing, and across the bay there were bald eagles in the tree nested, and they would always want to come down and see what I caught. And they'd be from me to that late. Away. It was such an amazing experience, and it's just me and them. And then I found out later some grizzly bears later came by to check in on my spot. Fortunately,
and what
I wasn't
you caught.
there then.
Yeah,
but yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And for those who are viewing this and listening at home, so Sitka, you mentioned it's a small town, so that's actually where. Now I'm a sucker for a good rom-com, but the movie The Proposal with Ryan Reynolds and Sandy Bullock took place in Sitka. It was filmed in Rockport, Massachusetts.
I was going to tell you, there are no lawns in Sitka. The minute I saw this broad sweeping lawn, I turned the movie off. I said, this is not Sitka.
And I just want to point out that most people say Sandra Bullock, but because you guys have a close personal relationship.
I feel very close. I've seen every one of her movies.
Get to call her Sandy.
But no, so when
She's been to Gilmanton,
Has she really?
Really?
Yes.
Wait, how do you know that?
So Gilmanton was the home of Grace Metalius, who wrote Peyton Place.
Yes.
And there's a very fascinating story that could be a topic of another one of your podcasts, but about her. But that book is an amazing book. I think everybody in New Hampshire should read it. It was a very early presentation of civil rights, spousal abuse, racism, blah, blah, blah. She explored a lot of that in that book. And Sandra Bullock became very interested in the woman who wrote the story rather than the story itself. So she wanted to create a movie about Grace Metalius. She filmed the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, it never made it to the screen. But so she was in Gilmanton. She wanted to meet the old timers who knew Sandra Bullock, to meet Grace Metalius. And
wow.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I never got to meet her, but my friend Henry did. And so she was in town.
We did New Hampshire Chronicle on Grace Metalius and Peyton Place way back in my day, and I had never heard that story. That's amazing.
I don't think anybody's heard it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But just to put a button on Alaska and Sitka.
Yeah.
So you said you had finished med school?
I was in med school.
You were in med school. And so what did you get what's your specialty?
So I went to the University of Rochester. I still work with them. We're doing a project on whole life, whole person care and how do you teach pain. Rochester is known for one thing. It's called the biopsychosocial model of medicine, which basically means that we're taught how to communicate with patients for every single minute of every single day that you're in med school. It's the only med school in the world that does this, and it's why I chose to go there. That was always really important to me. It still is, and one of my nonprofits, we kind of deal with that, and that's what I'm doing with U of R right now. I had no idea what I wanted to do because I really didn't want to be a doctor. I started working with elderly people when I was a kid. I became struck with how they struggle with end of life and functional loss. And it became like a mission to me to help them figure out how to preserve function as they got older to keep meaning in life. And it turned out that that was the whole message at Rochester, was finding out what's the meaning in life for you and how do we allow that to persist as long as it could. So then I started working at a cancer hospital and seeing people in the dying process. So I started thinking even more about that. And I wanted to start a business that would focus on function at end of life. And I didn't know how to do that. And somebody says, well, why don't you become a doctor? And I didn't see doctors as doing what I wanted to do. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, maybe a PT. And then they said, well, that's a good idea. And then somebody says, why don't you be a physiatrist? And I go, what's a physiatrist? They said, it's a PT doctor. I says, turns out that's not true. But, I then went and spent some time at a VA hospital. And
can you just tell us what a physiatrist?
Yeah.
So it's just from my knowledge,
the simplified version is that we focus on function, not diagnosis. So in other words, like you go see a doctor, they'll give you a diagnose something, they'll treat it, and hopefully you get better. If you don't, then you come see me. My job is to help people adapt to disability. Okay. And mostly it's physical disability, but I mean you can't separate emotional issues and psychological issues and spiritual issues. You can't separate that. So we look at the person as a whole person. And and then we help them to find ways to adapt to really challenging things. The reason when I came to New Hampshire, actually one of my big interests was head injury or head trauma. And so I was actually recruited to come here to start a head injury program that unfortunately never happened. I worked at Easter Seals at first, which is still one of my second favorite job after Sitka. And it was just sad that what I came here for never happened. But at the same point, the good thing was that at some point I came to understand that pain was part of every disability and nobody ever talked about it as its own thing. So one of the lessons that I did want to share with you that I learned when I was a kid, because I think it's really important.
We'll take all the free medical advice you can give us.
It's not a medical thing. It's a personal thing. So my mom has rheumatoid arthritis. She's portrayed prominently in my book because I'm everything because of her. I mean, my mom suffered terribly, but she was always there for other people. And she had this smile that kind of distracted people from her joints and swelling and all that stuff. And, in a very quiet way, she taught me what I wanted to be. But one day in school, there was this young girl. She just moved. We were in 4th grade. She just moved into town. She had bright red hair, which the boys thought was a good idea to pick on her for. And I was struggling. It's a Catholic school, and you're belittling somebody who's in a new place, and I just couldn't deal with that. And I at this whole time, I'm never realizing till decades later that I'm living my mom and what I did. And I just said, you guys, you can't treat her like that. And then I was shocked, the repercussions I took for that. And one of my friends, John Bell, who's a gentleman with sickle cell anemia, who has taught me a lot, he said that when we don't do the right thing frequently because we fear the ramifications of doing the right thing, which is being ostracized because you stand up for somebody. But it really empowered me. And I took that lesson all the way through medical school and all the way into physiatry, that I'm seeing these people in pain are being treated really badly by a society that's promising to stick up for people that need help. And I finally decided that somebody has to do this. So I shifted my entire focus from head injury, spinal cord injury, geriatrics into pain management.
And you've written a book about it too.
Yeah, right? That book started because I was really angry.
Don't all the best ones start that way?
I only write when I'm mad, or sad or mad. That book was written because I was really mad.
So this book, Needless Suffering, How Society Fails Those with Chronic Pain, available on Amazon, I believe, correct?
Yep. It was available next door, too.
And at Gibson's bookstore, our next door neighbors who we love, retailer of the year, love Gibson's.
That's right. So I think, it's really interesting that you decided to move into the focus of pain, right? Because I think everyone can relate to some sort of pain. And so I think that's really helpful. But in doing so, you've also found your way into, and I'm curious how this happened, but so you work with the NFL Players Association, and I believe you're a co-chair of one of their subcommittees.
Yes.
How did that come to be?
It was really weird. So my best friend on the planet, Myra Christopher, he used to run the Center for Practical Bioethics in Kansas City. She's the most amazing person I've ever met, but next to my mom. But anyways, Myra was nobody. She was a mother. I shouldn't say nobody because she's somebody, but she
wasn't well known.
Right. She was a mother, was very upset about how a family member got treated at the end of life. Basically, they turned that mission into the Center for Practical Bioethics, which this is a very gross oversimplification, but into like, how do we change the end-of-life experience? This was the 1970s. I got involved in this issue in the 1980s. And then I met Myra, I don't remember when. The only reason this is important was Myra became a national figure in how we manage pain, mostly at end of life, but at other times too. And so anyways, the NFL PA Players Association wanted to create this committee. So they call Myra up and they go, Myra, who should be on that committee? And if you walk into her office, her entire back shelf was nothing but my book, which I'm still honored with to this day. But anyways, so she said me. I was the only name she mentioned, and I don't really, to this day, don't know why she did that and whatever. So I get this phone call from somebody who says they're from the NFL Players Association, and I thought somebody was playing a joke on me.
Yeah. Wow.
So I said, yeah. Right? No, we really are. We want to start this committee. And, because it's an issue that we're not dealing well at virtually any level of athletics. So we want to make a difference, and we would like you to come. So I says, all right, where are we going? He says, D.C., we want you to come down here. He says, all right. So I go down to this meeting. There's 35 people there, and we're around the table. And I've been around professional football players my whole life because I grew up in Orchard Park. So there's no... The rose-colored glasses are off. So I'm impressed because they're very athletic, but at the same point, it's not a big deal to me. So we walk into this room. There's the head of the NFL PAs in the room, and there's these very athletic-looking people in the room, and then there's a lot of us. So anyways, we go around the room, and they really didn't know what they wanted to create because nobody's ever done this before. And I really wanted to create this because this is something this was a life dream, to create a guide for consumers on how to manage their pain that they can just resort to and not have to rely on a doctor. So anyways, they said, what do you want out of this? And I just said, you guys have done virtually nothing to justify your position in society. With that said, because you've done nothing, you have the responsibility to take whatever we create here and generalize it to the population as a whole, just like you did with head injury, which was accidental, but it was a good thing. So I said, this is what we need to do. If we're not going to do this, I don't want to be part of it. And then I stopped.
Wow.
And then I went home, and I just figured, well, that's the last I'll ever see the NFLPA. And I get a call a week later from my friend Betsy. And if you look at the name of the guide we created, it's called the Betsy Gilbert. It's in guide because unfortunately Betsy died of cancer shortly thereafter. But anyways, she calls me up and she says, we want you on the committee and we want you to chair the best practices committee. It's
wow.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
But it was like a dream come true because, I could sit down and create the thing I always wanted to do and have a very public forum to do it.
And are you still involved in it?
Yeah, kind of. It's kind of petered out a little bit, but It was really fun. I met some really neat people. I started a nonprofit to look at the whole issue of injury in athletics and athletic participation and, you know, a variety of things. And it was a good experience.
And what is the nonprofit that you started?
It's called the Nagel Pain Community, and I started that with Mary Owen, who is important to me for a variety of reasons. She's Ralph Wilson's niece. Ralph was the owner of the Bills for most of their history. I didn't know her at all through the Bills, but she was one of the first female executives in NFL history. She still works with the NFL, and her big interest is player safety, player health. The way we look at player health is the same way I would look at anything. We look at it from a whole life, whole person perspective. Mm-hmm. So what you do now will have ramifications for the rest of your life. And so whatever decisions you make now, you really need to think about, because too many people are taking advantage of athletes, living vicariously through them or getting something from them, mm-hmm. and not thinking of the athlete's best interests. So that was what we looked at as our role as the nonprofit, and also the committee, was how do we empower athletes with the knowledge they need to make the decisions they need to decide whether to play or not. Or, you know, is this worth it or not? Or how to do it more safely, or how to treat an injury or prevent an injury or whatever. And so that's what our thinking was when we started the nonprofit. And I ended up basically looking at the entire athletic network from professional all the way to peewee, about how do we do things, why do we do things, you know, is the system screwed up? And virtually every NFL player I've talked to has said, yes, the system is screwed up. It needs to be fixed. We need to put players' interests ahead, not behind everything else. So it's been quite a ride.
I bet.
I actually had a meeting earlier today about starting to look at college athletics and why do we do. What's the point of an athletic scholarship for an academic institution? And is the reward, the incentive screwed up? And how do we fix it to put the needs of the player first rather than the university and stuff like that? So it's been an amazing ride. I just, the more you do, the more you get involved with. So, but it's been fun.
No, and I think what you're doing is really important and really timely, because, you know, we hear about on the TV about CTE a lot, right? And the head injuries, which you mentioned.
Yep.
But this is something that, you know, can really go across all spectrums and everybody. And as you said, you know, we're going to create the best practices and we're going to share it with the general public, which is really important because, you know, as someone like myself who was a catcher from literally Little League through a couple of years in college, you know, my knees are terrible. I've already had one surgery on them, you know. But pain is something that everybody feels. So if you were to give advice to people to manage pain in any way, shape, or form, you know, for Tiffany and myself, aside from the pain in the neck that I am to her, you know, what would be your one piece of advice? And yes, we are looking for free medical advice right now.
And as we get older too, like, you know, Tom's very young. I'm like a couple decades older, but how can we what sort of insurance policy can we take it on ourselves so that maybe as we age, we aren't feeling as much pain?
Well, that's a really great question, because the entire concept I created is called justifiable risk. The decisions you make as a child will affect what the ramifications are on the rest of your life. And having interviewed a lot of retired NFL players who are having second thoughts about whether playing was worth it and they don't want their kids to do it, I mean, that's an important lesson. Like, one of the biggest things that I recommend, this is going to sound very nebulous, but stay in school. The best gift that you get, you know, this will sound very political, but as an American citizen, but the best gift that we can give a kid is an education. And what an education gives you is options. So in other words, I've worked with a lot of people that do heavy labor type work, which has ramifications for aging. And they only do it because it's the only option they've got. And they go, well, if you go to school, you can generate more options. And then maybe you can think, well, you know what? I'm at a dead end here. Like with an NFL player, we're always asking them, and now they're required to do this, to start thinking from the minute you get in the NFL, what are you going to do the rest of your life? How are you going to save this money? What are your options when you can't play in 3 years, which the typical player can't? What are you thinking? What are you doing? And it's the same thing that I think we need to think about as a childhood, because one of the big things that nobody ever talks about in healthcare, and I'm on a lot of committees right now that look at addiction, psychological duress, chronic disability, all these kinds of things. It's like, well, what are your options? You know, what happens when you hit a wall here? Where do you go? And I think that's what we tell people is you got to think about this stuff now. You have to have long-term planning, and prevention that's what I was getting at, was prevention. We never talk about prevention, and we really need to. We don't put any money into prevention. We've actually shown that. So to me, that sounds really stupid because it has virtually nothing to do with treating pain. But when you said, well, how do I plan for the rest of my life? Do the right thing here. And that way you'll be able to, you know, have a better, happier life, I think. I mean, if you love what you do, then fine, but just understand that there's going to be ramifications. So like I worked with a mason a couple of days ago, and he's a wreck. But he loved his job. And I said, well, if you love it and you're willing to know that this is what the ramifications, the justifiable risk is, then fine. But you need to think about that.
You know what you're saying is so true, and I can relate to it because, you know, when I started catching, right, it was my dad used to joke, oh, you're wearing the tools of ignorance. And I was like, oh, that's a cool name for it, right? The catcher's gear.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Right.
because it was so taxing on the body. And then when I was in college and I tore my meniscus and needed to get it repaired, I literally had that, you know, come to Jesus moment where I said, well, I'm not the next Jason Veritek. And so I need to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And it meant, you know, closing that chapter and, you know, going to DC for an internship or whatever. But what you're saying, keeping those options open and knowing when it's time to move on.
You know, it's really sad and weird, but like, you know, I think we need to think generationally too. Like, my grandparents moved here from Poland to give their family a better life. You know, Poland was under occupied, you know, whatever, and it was a miserable place to be in the late 1800s. So they came here through the Catholic Church to find a better life. And but I just kind of think that, you know, eventually I did get a better life. One of the problems that we see with the NFL guys is that I asked, you know, one of the thoughts that was mentioned is that after we're done doing the work that we're going to doing, we might conclude that playing football is a bad idea and we shouldn't be doing it. I think we concluded that before we started. But anyways, so I'm kind of thinking about this, and forgot where I was going with that.
Well, I think it's like the ramifications of the choices that we make,
Right.
and how we can prevent different things. But
Generationally, that's what I was going to get at. So a lot of the, thank you. So,
what I'm here
anyways,
for.
I asked him, I says, well, where are we going to, I don't get this. Where are we going to get players from? There's lots of things people can do. And they said, well, we will get players from the poor towns in the Southeast who playing football is a way to get out of that.
yeah.
And he says, we will always be able to get players from there. And I think that's a little sad because I would hope that we could help them elevate their lives in a different way than that. But at the
There's
same
still
point,
so
I
much-
understand what he's saying is
There's
true.
so much glory around it. I mean, we celebrate it as a nation. I mean, Sundays, every Sunday, where are most Americans hanging out? They're watching the NFL.
Yeah. Cursing at our fantasy football
at our
teams.
fantasy teams. Exactly. Weren't you going to ask questions because your players were?
No, they're all on the IR. I mean, I'm going to be caddying for someone.
I don't know him anyways, probably, but
And I guess,
I actually don't follow the NFL anymore, so
Yeah.
it's a long story.
but you are at Concord Orthopedics, you should, and so you're over there, which my daughter went to after she broke her wrist. So, you know, thank you. That was a long
I
process.
didn't do anything. Somebody did.
Yeah.
But I guess so. One of the other questions I have is you've had this incredible, you know, life living all over, and you know, certainly with the Players Association. But then, what inspired you to? And we don't get into the politics because it's anything but politics. But you have now become you're a second-term lawmaker. What was the inspiration to become a public servant?
There were a couple. One of them was I've been advocating for people's rights for over 30 years. And you become involved in legislation whether you want to or not doing that. There was I will say this publicly, that opioids have a role in the treatment of pain. They always have, they always will, and to not offer them to people that need them is inhumane and cruel. There was a law, or not a law, but guidelines passed by the CDC in 2016 that basically dramatically interfered with our ability to provide people that need pain medicine. I thought that we told our governor at the time and other people, you can't do this. You're going to kill people. And they did. They passed it and people died because they couldn't access services or people wouldn't give them to them or whatever. It's a long story, but a lot of people died. And I will go to my desk saying more people were harmed by that one rule than were ever harmed by prescription opioids. So with that as a background, we decided we needed to undo that damage. And we needed to go through a legislator to pass the bill. We were the first in the country to pass the bill. And I thought that was really great because I have another nonprofit it's a long story what that one is. But anyways, we passed the bill. And I all of a sudden realized that the bill took on a life of its own that I couldn't control as somebody that was not in the legislature. It was partially at that point that I became interested, but it goes back farther. Like one of my customers, I worked at this indoor tennis place near the Rich Stadium when I was a kid. I worked there for 12 years, but one of my customers was Jack Kemp. And he was still one of the most amazing politicians I've ever met. You know, and he had this vision of elevating inner city people by using because he worked with a lot of poor people in his NFL days and just a really neat man. And he just had a vision he could make a difference and make a change. And I said, wow, this guy's amazing and I can never be like him. But in that moment, when we passed that bill, I said, I can be like him. I'm not going to be vice presidential candidate. I'm not going to run HUD, but I can still do something. And I have his biography on my bookshelf. I look at it frequently as just a reminder, you know, of what people can do if they're really passionate about it. And I think that was why I finally chose to run. The third thing is I live in Belknap County, and not to refer to a specific group of people, but they were really harming Gunstock ski area. That was very public. What was not so public was what they were doing to entities like I'm on boards that oversee about 9 nursing homes. What I saw what they were doing in the nursing home, you know, like I asked my wife before if I could run for office. No. Then I should. When she saw what they were doing to the nursing home, because my wife works at nursing homes, she said, "You need to run." She made me run.
Yeah.
So, and I think my big thing is just protecting people's rights to health care and stopping what I call the coming medical apocalypse. That's, and we can talk about that if you want or not, but like, it's my mission. And my mission is to just, help the people that I've been trying to help for a long time.
No, I think that's wonderful. I would love to keep talking about it, but I think we're probably getting to the end of this one. But I do want to just pull up the book again because it's called Needless Suffering. And
this was not intended to do this, but this is fine.
Well, you know what? We appreciate you coming on. So, we're going to definitely give you a plug. So this is available on Amazon and also at our local retailer, Gibson's, which is our next door neighbor, and we love them.
Yeah.
And
just so people know, I travel all over the country speaking on these issues that we've touched on a little bit. I don't charge anything. I actually have lost a lot of money on this book, but that's not the value. The value is the mission, anyways. And so if anybody's interested, be happy to talk to your groups or whatever.
Yeah, and I will just say, just to put a button on everything, which is, your story about what made you decide to run and devote your life to service is so great. And I think New Hampshire is such a special place where you can do that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not that hard, but I think everyone should thank you for, the service you're giving to the state and what you've done for the NFL Players Association. I'll give you the names of my fantasy football players so you can kind of reach out to them and maybe help them out a little bit.
Right.
yeah, get some more points.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I grew up in New York State. The concept of me having an impact in New York State is close to zero. I mean, I've been able to make an impact in this state almost from the day I got here. It's like crazy and weird, but it's, and our legislature is diverse, not necessarily maybe phenotypically, but in terms of backgrounds.
Yeah.
The number of different type of backgrounds we have in that state house is amazing.
You're really plugging the podcast right now.
Yeah,
my God.
Yeah.
But it's like crazy. I mean, they're not all one stereotypical group of people. It's like so diverse, what people have done in their lives and stuff, and you bring them all together in one place so we can argue and herd cats and do whatever political people do. It's awe-inspiring. It really is. at times it's frustrating, but at times it's like, wow, I'm so fortunate to be part of this. So
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. Well, we're so fortunate to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
And, hopefully you'll come back and,
it'd be awesome.
hopefully you had a good time. But this was fascinating. So thank you.
Sure. My pleasure.
Well, on behalf of Anything But Politics, I'm Tiffany Eddy from Tiffany Eddy Media.
And I'm Tom Prasol. And thank you for listening and watching.